Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Big box retailers, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a bill in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. Senate Bill 1838 would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, visit handsoffmyrewards.com and tell them to oppose credit card routing legislation paid for by the Electronic Payments Coalition.
Bummer, the holidays are over. No more presents. But yay, you have your freedom again. The new year is full of ups and downs, but however you're feeling, you can always be happy with Prime Video. Catch the new season of Reacher. Rent or buy new releases like Taylor Swift's The Eras Tour extended version. You can add on hundreds of streamers. One app, one password. Prime Video. Find your happy place. Restrictions apply. Prime membership not required to rent or buy. See Amazon.com/Amazon Prime for details.
Hello and welcome to the Paddock and the Pavilion with Stephen Wallace. In each show, Stephen will interview someone connected to the world of horse racing or cricket.
On today's podcast, I'm joined by Chris Pitt, author and racing historian, to talk about Tim Brookshaw, National Hunt Champion jockey in 1958-59, who is remembered for his remarkable ride in the 1959 Grand National. Hello, Chris.
Hello there, Stephen.
Well, thanks for joining me on the Paddock and the Pavilion. I've just read your latest book, Fearless, about Tim Brookshaw. He certainly was fearless.
Yeah, I think that the Fearless title summed up the man. Yes, National Hunt jockeys are pretty fearless as a race of people, aren't they? Perhaps they were more of a cavalier bunch back in the 50s and 60s, the Scudamores, Biddlecombe's, Giffords, Nicholsons. But Brookshaw was a man of iron will determination. He fought back from a broken back, not just to walk again, but to jump fences again and even ride in a charity race. And as Bruff Scotty said in the foreword, he had a spirit that's defied diminution.
Thanks for that introduction. I'd like to begin with his most famous ride. This is in the Grand National on the 21st of March, 1959. Could you set the scene for us for that race?
Yes, indeed. Big field, led over the water jump by Jerry Scott and Michael Scudamore and Tim Brookshaw on Oxo and Wyndburgh, respectively, are lying up there in the first 3 or 4, and they're having a chat go down to Becher's because Brookshaw was a bit like that. He'd be talking about how the cows and heifers were going at home, even though he's riding over the most fearsome fences in the country. And they come to Becher's Brook, and Jerry Scott's mount falls, and Tim's, as he's landing on Wyndburgh, the stirrup breaks. Now, not just the stirrup leather, I hasten to add, the actual iron itself snaps in two. And there's Brookshaw with 8 fences and 1.5 miles of the Grand National to go, riding with just one iron. He kicks his other foot out of the iron and rides as near bareback as makes no difference, shouting out to Michael Scudamore, I've lost my iron, what shall I do? With maybe a couple of expletives thrown in. And Scudamore just didn't answer and thought, thank heaven for that. Brookshaw goes on to finish second, beaten about 1.5 lengths, and would probably have won the race had he had 2 irons to ride with. He didn't. He wasn't a great man to make a fuss. The following day, while milking the cows, would simply admit to feeling a bit stiff.
Yeah, you've taken the words out of my mouth there, Chris, with my notes here. Tim was on a fancied horse that day, wasn't he?
Wyndburgh, yes, had already finished second in a Grand National and was to become Tim's ride. He was trained by Ken Oliver, and Tim, towards the latter part of his career, rode a lot of horses for Ken Oliver. And yes, this was one of the great Aintree campaigners, second altogether in 3 Grand Nationals without ever quite getting his head in front. And yes, he was one of the favourites and obviously stood every chance of winning it when the incident occurred.
And in 1959, when were the fences changed a little at Aintree? Because they were very stiff in those days, weren't they?
They were, and ironically, they were changed just the very next year. when Merriman won, ridden by Jerry Scott. They had aprons put on the front of the fences so they weren't bolt upright. But when Tim rode in them in the race the year before, that's exactly what they were like. They were big, upright fences with big drops on the landing side.
And this was the last national before BBC started televising the race.
That's right, it was. And the interesting thing is that the first ever race televised from Aintree was actually the Molyneux Chase of 1958, which Tim himself won the race. And so he did win races over the Grand National fences, but not the big one.
And earlier I asked former leading jockey and BBC TV racing presenter Richard Pitman how difficult it would be to ride without stirrups.
You wouldn't want to do it, I can assure you. And you would get tired. It's easy with stirrups to take a rest if you need one. You know, you rest your hands with a bridge of the reins over the neck and just relax a little bit if you want the horse to get a breather and yourself to get a breather. But if you've no stirrups, the art of staying on is totally balance and grip, more importantly. We have some jockeys are split jumping into horsemen and jockeys. Some are jockeys and horsemen. But someone like Tim Brookshaw would have been brought up on ponies, hunting. He'd have started riding with no saddle. And that's important because you have to grip to stay on, self-preservation. So the jumps as they were in those days in 59 were big, the drops big, the corners very acute. So very, very difficult. Fred Winter himself, who I rode for, was a great horseman, rode round Otoy with the reins broken, using his body weight to sway the horse around corners and things. So very, very difficult. What is amazing, someone like Oisin Murphy, who's taking sabbatical for a couple of years from the flat racing, is show jumping and also hunting and team chasing now. And he is a horseman of the nth degree. Irish, probably brought up, as I say, with no saddle. So difficult is the answer to your question. You would get tired staying on, keeping your balance, keeping your grip for so long. Very difficult.
Just to go back to the beginning of Tim's career. In fact, he was called Tim, but he was christened Stanley James.
Yes, that's quite right. A lot of people have speculated about that. He was born in 1929, and maybe some people thought it was after Tipperary Tim, a Shropshire horse that had won the Grand National the year before. But no, it was nothing to do with that. It was simply that Tim's mother had a very close friend. They were pretty much sisters, and she was engaged to a chap named Tim Ward. Tim, unfortunately, died young, and when they went to see him in hospital shortly before he died, they had the young lad with them, Tim's mother and father, and Tim Ward said to them, "Whatever you do, don't name your child Tim because it's never brought me any luck." He knew he was a dying man. And so they named him Stanley James, the Stanley after his father and the James after his grandfather. But from the day they did that, he was always known at home as Tim. And Tim, he remained throughout his career.
And was he destined to be a jockey? Because both his brothers also raced, didn't they?
Yes, it was aspirational, but not really, because he was from a family of farmers, and farmers were the sort of career, farming with the sort of career that you thought he'd go into. But of course, like most lads of that age, it started with his pony clubs and gymkhanas, went on to points immediately after the war. Decided then to go on as an amateur rider, and his father took out a permit so that he could give him some help, and rode his first ever winner at War, the old racecourse at War, in May 1948 on a horse called Ike II. And it was perhaps typical of him, and the way that his future would continue, is that, the form book says that he won the race on Ike. What it doesn't reveal is that he actually rode with a cracked facial bone and a bandage around his jaw from a fall a couple of weeks earlier. So that's the sort of man he was. I've
got to ask you, I've written this down. Where is War?
War is a Shropshire course. It's just it's in Shropshire, close to a little village called Pipe Gates. And Pipe Gate was actually where War Racecourse was. So the answer to that is it's a Shropshire venue.
And no doubt you'll know exactly when they stopped racing at War.
They stopped racing in 1963 in June. They leased the land. And it was during the mini beaching act, if you like, Stephen, of when it was decided that it wasn't economic to have so many race courses and they wanted to close down a dozen. And War was one of those. It had about 4 days a year when it raced. And they knew the lease was coming up and wasn't guaranteed to be renewed. It also clashed with a local point-to-point. And Bill Tellwright, a noted amateur rider of the time who organised the point-to-point, was quite keen on seeing that there was no further clashes, so that when War actually rung down the curtain, it was a great benefit for the local point-to-point.
And you mentioned earlier that Tim was a farmer and he combined farming with riding, which sort of stopped him winning as many races as he could have won.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right, because the dairy farming was a summer occupation. So rather than the traditional start of the season down in Devon at Newton Abbot and Buckfastleigh and Exeter, Tim wouldn't actually get going until probably the first meeting at War in October. And those first 2 months just passed him by, where he was far too busy with the farm to go on about riding. And it was only in the latter years that in the late 50s when he decided he'd make a determined bid for the championship, and you'd find him riding at Newton Abbot and Exeter in August.
And he was champion jockey in 1958-59 season. So did he start early that year?
Yes, he did. It started early the year before, and that gave him a taste for doing it. And all the way through the season, it was a battle between Tim and Fred Winter. And by the time they got to April, I think there was only 4 or 5 winners in between the two of them. And Fred had a bad fall at Fontwell Park, broke his jaw, and that was him for the season. So Tim was left then to continue. And I think he rode about 89 winners that year, which doesn't sound a lot by today's standards, but that's how it was then. And ironically, his season was ended about a fortnight before the end when he broke his leg in a race at Taunton. So he was far enough clear not to be overtaken, but ended the season with a broken leg.
And that was the same year of his famous ride in the Grand National.
Yes, it was, absolutely. Yeah, that the broken leg occurred about 2 months after Wyndburgh's second place. Yes, indeed. He was really at the peak of his career then in the late 50s.
And national hunt racing was very different in those days, less meetings. And I would imagine getting about the country because of the roads would be very different from today.
Well, yes, but it didn't seem to matter to Tim in some ways, who was a very noted fast driver. Ivor Markham, a jump jockey from the 1960s, used to travel with him to some of these meetings down in the southwest and couldn't believe how quickly they got there. There were no speed cameras in those days, of course. And Brookshaw, who actually did say that at one stage, if he hadn't been a jockey, he would like to have been a racing driver, drove like a racing driver all the way down there. He was pretty hairy.
So his character was like a daredevil person.
Yes, very much. I think that summed up by the occupation that he undertook as a national hunt jockey. They, in those days, were very, very... Well, daredevil is one word, and of course, they didn't have the protection of that they have now. The skull caps were basically piece of fiberglass with no strap that would come off at the slightest bump. So, it was perhaps a more daredevil profession then than it is now.
And that's another question I posed to Richard Pitman, and this is what he had to say about Tim's character.
He was a broad Shropshire farmer, accent-wise. hard man from a hard family, very capable, with a great character. Because if you're farming a lot of cattle and other things, you get a lot of setbacks as well as a lot of pluses. And so he was a character. In the weighing room, he used to entertain us all. But his favorite saying was, when he'd meet you or meet someone else, "How now, brown cow?" And he even said it to the Queen Mother one day, and she roared with laughter. I think she'd probably been, given the thumbs up, or not thumbs up, said that this is what he can come out with, Mom, Anyway, he did, and she loved it. But what a great way to greet people. "How now, brown cow?" So a great character, and superb to be in the weighing room. And it was a marvellous era.
He did win the Scottish Grand National in 1963.
He did, yes, on Papageno's Cottage, trained by Ken Oliver, Wyndburgh's trainer. And he only ever rode one winner at Cheltenham, which was again for Ken Oliver on a horse called Happy Arthur. The thing with Brookshaw, he rode 550 winners. You would never call him a great jockey in terms of style. He certainly wasn't stylish. He won his races out in the country. And nearly all the photos you've got of Brookshaw, interestingly, show him with his arm raised, jumping the last. And in fact, the pictures were really one of the things that I was thinking, how on earth am I going to get hold of these? But as it turned out, the book itself contains about 80 of them.
But Cheltenham wasn't quite as big as it is today with all the Grade 1 races.
No, Cheltenham wasn't. The 2 Mile Champion Chase only started in 1959. But it was still the headquarters of racing, of course, and they only raced on the old course. But Tim, the best horse he ever rode was at Cheltenham, not at the big meeting, but at the April meeting. And it's one that I'm absolutely certain that every listener today will have heard of, and that was Millhouse. Millhouse had one run over fences at Hurst Park, which had ended in a fall, and he'd lost his confidence. And the trainer, who was Sid Dale at the time, wanted someone who would get the horse round safely and build that confidence back up. And they entrusted Tim Brookshaw with the ride. And this was in April 1962. And over the first 2 or 3 fences, he could see that Millhouse was scared of what he was doing. So he took the horse right to the outside and rode him as if he was schooling at home, if you like, away from the rest of them. Gradually, Millhouse starts to build up that confidence. He's gaining his position, and coming to the second last, he's going very, very well, jumps the last and goes away to win very impressively. So much so, I think that Peter O'Sullivan, who was calling the race, said that something to the effect of, I've rarely seen a horse win so easily at Cheltenham. And Len Thomas, who was the Sporting Life senior racing correspondent at the time, he said, this is an outstanding horse and should be a live contender for next year's Cheltenham Gold Cup, which 12 months or 11 months before the race was quite a prescient statement. But sure enough, Millhouse went on to win the Gold Cup, but not with Tim on. And the reason for that was that during the summer, Millhouse's owner, Bill Gollings, and trainer Sid Dale had a bit of a falling out. Gollings then transferred Millhouse and his other horses to Fulk Warwin, for whom Willie Robinson was the stable jockey. Robinson thereby inherited the ride, and that was it. And that was the last time that Tim ever got to sit on Millhouse. And ironically, there's a picture in the Hennessy Gold Cup of November 63, which was the only occasion when Millhouse beat Arkle. And you've got Millhouse jumping the fence with Arkle alongside, and just to Arkle's right is Tim Brookshaw on Papageno's Cottage, the horse he'd won the Scottish National on. And that would have been the month before the fall that ended his career.
Yeah, you're talking then about his fall at Aintree, where he did have quite a bit of success. You'd already mentioned the Molyneux Chase, but he won some big races at Aintree.
He did, yeah. He won the Molyneux Chase for the first time in 1951. And that in itself is quite interesting, Stephen, because we all know and have seen many, many times the footage of Devon Lock in the Grand National and Dick Francis and the horse sprawling to the ground within 50 yards of the winning post. Well, something that happened 5 years before that was remarkably similar, because in the 1951 Molyneux Chase, Dick Francis was riding a horse called Possible, and Tim was riding a horse called Royal Stuart. Possible jumped the last fence in the Molyneux about 5 lengths in front, and stayed that way up the run-in. And with about 50, 60 yards to run, Possible is still 4 or 5 lengths clear with the race in the bag. And he pulls himself up virtually to a walk and is beaten a short head on the line by Tim Brookshaw. And this is something that Francis, not just once, but twice, lost 2 races over the Grand National course in the last 50 yards when it got it sewn up. And it's quite remarkable that particular race I only found out about by reading some of the cuttings in Tim's scrapbooks. It's just amazing how Dick Francis had actually lost that race on the line 5 years before the Devon Lock incident. And also, Tim, as you mentioned, did win other races. He won the Grand Sefton Chase on a horse called Eternal, who was a Grand National regular. And so, yes, he did have plenty of success over the fences. But, of course, it was at Aintree that his career was ended.
Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Big box retailers, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a bill in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. Senate Bill 1838 would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, visit handsoffmyrewards.com and tell them to oppose credit card routing legislation paid for by the Electronic Payments Coalition.
Yes, on the 4th of December 1964, he suffered a life-changing injury riding Lucky Dora.
Yes, that's right. And ironically, it was a hurdle race. No one particularly wanted to go on. And so Tim himself decided to make the running on Lucky Dora. And all went fairly well until when they were in the back straights, sort of out of view of most of the people, to be honest, except those with binoculars. And what happened was Lucky Dora was then taken on by another horse, panicked perhaps, and crashed through the wing of the hurdle. And it was a horrific fall where Tim landed on his face and his stomach, and his feet jackknifed over his back. So if his feet were almost touching his head. It was that awful. Yes, he was taken then to Walton Hospital that night, obviously in a very serious condition. He was told by the doctors that he would never, ever walk again. But Tim was the sort of character, and as I mentioned, the iron will determination. He was the man who was determined above everything to prove them wrong.
And he certainly did that, Chris, didn't he? Not only did he walk again, he sat on a horse again. He was a trainer. He worked on the farm, and he also won a Paralympic silver medal. Yes,
that's right. So within about 9-10 months of that fall, he was in Tokyo for the Paralympics, which, of course, in those days didn't have anything like the cachet or the coverage that you have now, which they follow a fortnight after the Olympics. They were very much a forgotten about thing there. But Tim represented Britain in the javelin from his wheelchair, and Julie won a silver medal, which his son still has. So that in itself was a remarkable achievement. He also was involved in various other wheelchair sports, wheelchair basketball. And I mean, he left hospital within about 2 months. And later that summer, he he managed to put together some sort of winch systems where he was able to haul himself up and position himself on the back of their children's pony so that he was actually in the saddle again. Legs paralyzed, obviously, but able to control the horse with his hands. And to do that after you've been told you'll never walk again. And I think that is it in many ways, because if you broke your back in the early 1960s, as he did, you were pretty much confined to a wheelchair. There were no treadmills, there were no personal trainers, there were no hydro pools to get you to work those muscles again. That was pretty much it. And I think Elaine Meller said that there was no motivation, but Tim himself motivated himself to a degree that was pretty much unknown then. And that again, I think, is what makes him such an intriguing character.
Yeah, we forget all the things that are now available that weren't available in Tim's time. And Tim's fall also began the process towards the Injured Jockeys Fund following another jockey's fall, Paddy Farrell, in the 1964 Grand National. Yes,
that's exactly right. Tim was actually invited to that Grand National and attended, and was there when Paddy Farrell, riding a horse called Border Grace, fell at the chair in 64 and broke his back in an even worse way than Tim had done. And he, again, was taken to hospital where he was told he would never walk again. After those two injuries, the public, racing itself began to wonder about whether these guys are compensated enough. And shortly after the Grand National, there was actually an article which appeared in the Daily Mail by a columnist named J.L. Manning. And just to quote from it here, it says, Paddy Farrell lies paralysed with a broken back in a Southport hospital. He has 4 children, all under 6. Now, at that time, as he points out, if a jockey is injured, he may receive £12, 5 shillings a week for 52 work weeks from the National Hunt Accident Fund, to which each jockey must contribute 5 shillings for every horse he rides and half his licence fee every year. But if he's totally incapacitated, he may receive up to £4,000. If he dies within a year, his widow may be given the choice of either £3,000 or £3 per week, which was really nothing. And Manning called for the compulsory insurance of all poorly paid National Hunt jockeys, which they were. And he ended by saying, we must not let the sporting conscience of a welfare state vanish down a 19-inch tube, i.e. you see it on TV and forget about it. So what happened was that Clifford Nicholson, who was the main owner with Charlie Hall, for whom Farrell was the stable jockey and effectively therefore was Farrell's employer, he organised a fund to try and get some donations for the 2 stricken jockeys. Mirabelle Topham, the owner of Aintree, was the first woman to put money into the pot and donated £1,000. It was sensationally successful. By April, they'd gathered over £30,000. There was everything that people are organising, dances and film shows. There were collection boxes in these stuffy old betting offices which had opened 2 years before. And it was so successful that Farrell and Brookshaw said, look, there is just far too much money here than we need. And John Lawrence, later Lord Oaksey, wrote a letter to the Sporting Life saying that we intend to have this fund distributed not just to these 2, but to all injured National Hunt jockeys. The Injured National Hunt Jockeys Fund eventually morphed into the Injured Jockeys Fund, but that was the catalyst for what we have today.
That's a very fantastic story. Now we've got these 3 fabulous centres at Moulton, Lambourne and Newmarket, where jockeys, flat and jump jockeys, can go to rehabilitate. And, it's just such a difference to what it was when Tim fell back in all those days.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, if only those things had been around far, far earlier. Jack Berry, of course, was just instrumental in so much of this. And when Paddy Farrell had the fall, he was one of several northern jockeys who used to go around with collecting boxes and at the races themselves, getting donations from the public. And the public were absolutely great about it, and they'd be putting money into the boxes. And again, this is why the fund was so successful.
But sadly, Tim had one more fall when he aged only 52, which ended his life.
Yes, that's right. I mean, Tim, what he did after the fall was really quite remarkable. He took up training, not just training horses from a wheelchair or anything, but actually riding the horses over fences on the gallops. And what happened one day was that there was a particularly fractious horse that his stable staff said, this horse is acting up a bit, leave it alone, we'll take him out after we've galloped the others. But Brookshaw wasn't like that. Brookshaw was a man who would not be defeated by a horse. He'd seen all this before. He'd ridden horses like this before. He saddled the horse up, took him out on towards the gallops. The horse was bucking and rearing. He reared to the effect that Brookshaw, who of course had no power, or little power beneath the waist, was thrown off. And being a jockey, you automatically hold on to the reins. The horse double-barreled him in the back of the neck, and Brookshaw was paralyzed again. And that was an injury from which he never recovered.
We've got to go back to Aintree because I've got a couple of other things I wanted to mention about Tim and connected to Tim. And the two stirrup pieces were both found. And earlier, again, I spoke to Richard Pitman, who at the time working for the BBC recalled the story of how the second smaller part was found. And this is what Richard had to say.
Yes, now that was my idea, and it came about. I'm very chatty, as you know, and I like people. And when I was at Taunton Races At the Races, as it was called then, now Sky TV, I would talk to all the gate men. I knew all the gate men, and people have interesting stories. And I got chatting to a guy called John McGay, and I'm not quite sure how it's spelt, who manned the crossing after the paddock to get across the course for the horses to go to the start. I got chatting to him. It turned out that he was a former Justice of the Peace and also British ambassador at one of the foreign satellites, and there he is on the gate, most people just walking past him, educated, interesting, fascinating man. And after about the third or fourth time I'd been speaking to him, he put his hand in his pocket and pulled out this little shiny bit of metal. He said, "This will interest you, Richard." And that was the story. He had been up there for the first time when Tim's stirrup broke in the race, and it broke up near the top where the leather goes through. That's why it's come apart, you see. If it had broken down below, might have been easier, who knows. But John, after he watched it from down by Becher's Brook, and after the race was over, instead of walking back up to the stands, he decided to walk the course and see what it was like on foot, and came across this little shiny bit of metal. And there it was, about an inch long. It was the top piece of the stirrup. So I made inquiries of Steve Brookshaw, who was training at the time, trained Lord Galleen to win the National. And he said, "Oh, yes, we've got the bulk of the stirrup, but we haven't got the little bit." So I was able to marry them up. And we recorded this piece with both John McGay and with I think it was a nephew who had the other bit of the stirrup. We put them together just like a jigsaw. It was magic. I thought, well, that's good television. Anyway, I'm doing my bits and it doesn't come on. And I get on the old intercom to the producer. "What's happened to that bit about the stirrup?" "Oh, we've had to drop 3 pieces," he said, "because there's some mishap on the race course. We've got to concentrate on that." And so it never went out. But it was lovely to bring the people together. But the story, here it is. Oh, I'd have bought that for very good money because it's history and it will never go away.
It'd be lovely to see that story on TV now, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I should think it's in the archives. I ought to give them a ring.
But the family were successful at Aintree in 1997 when Tim's nephew, Steve Brookshaw, trained the winner, Lord Gilleen.
That's right. And of course, that was the famous year when the race was run on the Monday. And Steve himself was very, very helpful with the book, as was Tim's son, also named Tim, and his stepson, Wayne Spedding, who was the catalyst for the book. The family itself, Stephen, was they were keen that the story should be told warts and all. And this, again, is why it makes the story much more interesting, because Tim was the life and soul of the party, but family relationships weren't as good. He was a very, very hard taskmaster. Yes, he was not a saint. He had affairs. He was divorced from his first wife, who then, unfortunately, slid into alcoholism and ended up taking her own life. He remarried. There are some very dark parts of this book involving suicide, alcoholism, and the like. But as I say, I think it's stronger for that. And the fact is that the whole story has been told. It's not beatifying this man as a saint. He was a genuine human being with faults and an iron will determination. And it's probably that iron will that helped him to make such a great job of his recovery.
And Chris, perhaps Tim's legacy really is the Injured Jockeys Fund, which does so much today for flat and jump jockeys.
I think so, yes. It was the Farrell Brookshaw Fund, which then was extended to become the Injured National Hunt Jockeys Fund. And then, of course, we realised that flat jockeys get injured too. And that's what became the Injured Jockeys Fund, which, of course, is a fantastic charity that does so much good work for not just retired jockeys, but also jockeys present recovering from injuries and so on and so forth. And yes, it would be great to think that is the legacy of Tim Brookshaw.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Chris, for writing the book. It's a story about someone who many people of today will have forgotten, but he really was Superman, remembered for losing a race, but the things he achieved up until his death at the young age of only 52.
Yeah, and it was his refusal to give in to the cards that life had dealt him. And that, I think, resonates not just across racing, but across all sports that carry a risk of life-changing injuries. He was you could say, an inspiration to anyone in adversity.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for joining me on the Paddock and the Pavilion. It's been a great story to tell, and I'd recommend anyone to read your book, Fearless, about Tim Brookshaw.
Thank you. It's been great talking with you. It's available via Amazon or the publisher's New Generation Publishing. And I think it's a really good story.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to The Paddock and the Pavilion. You can download the show on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, SoundCloud, Stitcher and Spotify.
Follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at The Pad and Pav. Don't forget, if you like the show, please do leave us a rating and review.
Sports Social Podcast Network.
Today, we discuss Miro. Today, I want to talk about the hellscape that is technical diagramming, right? Everybody's nodding their heads right now. And there is a potential solution that I want to share. There was one name that several people brought up. I did some digging, and it's kind of nuts how much this program Miro has for developers. I have to share this. It could potentially be a game changer for you. So my favorite part about Miro is that half the work is already done. Like right now, typically we spend hours starting diagrams from scratch, gathering information. You get buy-in from every team. That's a lot of work to do. But Miro has a full set of integrations with the tools you're probably already using. And they also offer open APIs and SDKs for custom solutions for all those niche diagramming programming use cases we have to do, right? So the end result is the same, but it doesn't take forever. It's a massive, massive time saver. I'm transforming basic flowcharts and network architectures, and it all lives in one place. So are you using Miro? Have you used it? I want to hear.
That's Miro.com.